In a case that is begging for absolute statements, a case that is crying out for black and white certainty, well, here it is in black and white. So why ruin it for with a little fact checking? Why ruin a rare black and white story with more gray area stuff? Well, that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to reveal these unspoken about gray areas in Technicolor detail. And so what better way to do that than to look at Mary Lacy's letter in full and see whether it can justify itself or whether it can't, and see whether Stan Garnett's problems with it are justified or not. Curiously, like the ransom note, the letter is addressed to Mr. Ramsey. And this is an excerpt of the note, certainly not an excerpt, but it's the full note, the full letter to John Ramsey, republished in the Denver Post, dated July 9th, 2008. Mr. John Ramsey, as you are aware, since December 2002, the Boulder District Attorney's Office has been the agency responsible for the investigation of the homicide of your daughter, JonBenet. I understand that the fact that we have not been able to identify the person who killed her is a great disappointment. That is a continuing hardship for you and your family. Now, you can already see the obvious sympathy in the opening paragraph, but then it goes up a gear. However, significant new evidence has recently been discovered through the application of relatively new methods of DNA analysis. Now, there are actually two problems with that. It's not really new evidence, this DNA sample that had all along. And also, this thing about new methods of DNA analysis, they're talking about that in 2008. So to talk about that we need new DNA analysis today, when that has already been brought to bear on the samples, is actually quite silly. The letter goes on to note, this new scientific evidence convinces us that it is appropriate, given the circumstances of this case, to state that we do not consider your immediate family, including you, your wife, Patsy, and your son, Burke, to be under any suspicion in the commission of this crime. I wish we could have done so before Mrs. Ramsey died. Now, that addition of that point, I wish we could have told you this before Patsy died, is another sign of the sympathy that the district attorney's office have with this family. So they're operating from a perspective of independence. Now remember, this significant new evidence was found in 2006. The letter was only published in 2008. All these developments occurred almost 20 years ago, and yet 20 years later, we are still hearing the same tired cliche that was in this letter. It's all about DNA, and DNA is going to solve this case. And in 2008, Mary Lacy was talking about the latest DNA methods providing a breakthrough. So you're really telling me 20 years later, we still need to be sort of towing that line? Because it's silly to be doing that. Doesn't it sound familiar? Here we are in 2025, 20 years later, almost, and suddenly the DNA is brand new, and suddenly new DNA technology is going to provide brand new breakthroughs. Oh, like it did in 2006. And let me reiterate, this DNA found was the same as the DNA they had all along in January 1997. And the grand jury heard the evidence about the DNA that was found right from the get-go, and they weren't persuaded by it. So what changed between the grand jury and Mary Lacy? Mary Lacy obviously took her cue from her predecessor, who suggested that there wasn't evidence to convict the Ramseys, and there wasn't sufficient evidence all along. And yet when Lacy's tenure started, she felt a single strand of DNA was enough evidence not only to clear the Ramseys, all of them, wholesale, but to pursue another mega blunder, which I think really revealed a rash approach to this case, a fixation with the intruder theory. And by the way, we do know that Mary Lacy was a huge fan of the intruder theory. Like Lou Smith, she was a big proponent of it. And a failure, even as a seasoned legal practitioner, to think scientifically and logically about a case, even when dealing with the most sciencey area, well, it was this DNA. Now, I don't want to jump the gun, though. We'll get to the clown show that was Mary Lacy pursuing John Mark Carr all the way to Thailand in probably the most spectacular blunder of this entire case. We'll get to that. You never hear John talking about that, though. It's always Linda Arndt. But compared to what Mary Lacey did, Linda Arndt was, well, perhaps not quite Sherlock Holmes by comparison, perhaps more the Dr. Watson of this case. Not nearly as bad as John implies when you think about what Mary Lacey did, just the absurdities of that. I mean, compared to how badly the DA botched this case, on top of the botching of the previous DA. And yet, reading her letter, her reasoning seems fairly sound at face value. It seems eloquent and clear-headed, doesn't it? Let's go back to her letter. We became aware last summer that some private laboratories were conducting a new methodology described as touch DNA. Now, we know today that touch DNA is actually quite old technology by modern standards. It's been with us for a long time, but certainly in 2008, it was quite new. One method of sampling for touch DNA is the scraping method. This is a process in which forensic scientists scrape places where there are no stains or other signs of the possible presence of DNA to recover for analysis any genetic material that might nonetheless be present. We contracted with the Bow Technology Group, a highly reputable laboratory recommended to us by several law enforcement agencies, to use the scraping method for touch DNA on the long johns that JonBenet wore and that were probably handled by the perpetrator during the course of this crime. And she's right. In many cases, DNA can be very important evidence. Let's return to her letter. The Biotechnology Laboratory was able to develop a profile from DNA recovered from the two sides of the long johns. The previously identified profile from the crotch of the underwear worn by JonBenet at the time of the murder matched the DNA recovered from the long johns at Bode. The key word here is previously identified profile, which means this isn't new evidence. This is the oldest evidence from January 1997 that's been re-verified. But here is where the false note, one false assumption, ruins the whole symphony. Unexplained DNA on the victim of a crime is powerful evidence. The match of male DNA on two separate items of clothing worn by the victim at the time of the murder makes it clear to us that an unknown male handled these items. Despite substantial efforts over the years to identify the source of this DNA, there is no innocent explanation for its incriminating presence at 3 sites of these 2 different items of clothing that JonBenet was wearing at the time of her murder. The fact is, there could be numerous innocent explanations, just as the pubic hair that first seemed to be a bombshell breakthrough could later be explained as not only not a pubic hair, but an auxiliary hair likely belonging to Patsy that simply transferred from the dryer onto JonBenet's blanket. But more to the point, how could there be an innocent explanation for unexplained DNA in several places? And we will get to that in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.